Who knocks at midnight? Chitral's most haunted guest house. Spine-chilling horror story. I arrived in Chitral just before dusk, when the last rays of sunlight thread themselves through pine branches like they're trying to hold on. The air smelled of snow and wood smoke. Even before I saw the building, I heard the wind push through the valley in slow, cold sighs, as if the place itself was breathing. The guest house stood alone, a little uphill from the river, behind a sloping wall of stone and cracked wooden fencing. Faded blue paint peeled from the shutters. The windows looked like they hadn't been opened in years. It reminded me of the old rest houses I used to stay at with my father when he worked in forest management, back when silence meant something else. I hadn't planned on stopping here. But the driver, a quiet man with chapped lips and a cracked wristwatch, said this was the only working lodge for people who come from outside. The way he said outside made me feel like I didn't belong here. Not in the casual, city versus village way. In the way you speak of someone walking into the wrong room at the wrong time. The woman at the front desk didn't speak much. She slid a rusted key across the counter, nodded toward the stairs, and went back to what she was doing, though I never saw what that was. The reception area was dim, with a single bulb hanging low and swaying slightly even though the air was still. A large grandfather clock stood by the staircase, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. It read 12:08. I didn't think much of it then. The room she gave me was small, but clean. Worn wooden floors, a bed with an old quilt, and a desk facing a window that opened to the forest. No TV, no Wi-Fi. I'd brought my notebook and DSLR, though I already knew I wouldn't be using the camera much. This story wasn't about visuals. It was about atmosphere. The kind you don't photograph, you just feel. I unpacked, took a few photos of the room for the blog, and sat at the desk with a cup of bitter instant coffee. The silence was complete. No car horns, no humming refrigerators. Only the distant rustling of pine needles and the occasional crack of wood settling in the beams above. That first night, I didn't sleep easily. Not because anything happened, nothing really did. But there was something about the quiet that didn't sit right. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The bed was warm, though the room was too cold for early November. I kept the quilt pulled high, my ears straining without reason. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were soft, unhurried, not sneaky, just out of place. Like someone pacing without intent. I waited, expecting them to stop. They didn't. After what felt like 10 minutes, they paused directly outside my door. There was no knock. No shadow beneath the frame. Just stillness. Then, slowly, they moved on. I didn't open the door. I told myself it was another guest. Perhaps someone jet-lagged or restless. The brain wants reasons. I wanted one too. The next morning, I asked the caretaker, the same woman who gave me the key, if anyone else was staying. She shook her head. Only you? Her voice was dry, almost hoarse. She didn't ask why I was curious. Just turned and walked into the kitchen. By noon, the power flickered twice. I shrugged it off as normal for the area. I'd stayed in remote villages before. Still, it bothered me that the clock downstairs hadn't moved since I arrived. Even when the lights were back, the pendulum stayed still. 12:08, always. That afternoon, I found a guest book at the corner of the lounge. Thick with dust, but the pages inside were relatively clean. Most of the entries were old, 2017, 2018. A few pages in, I found something that made my hands pause. An entry dated May 14, 2028. Signed Adil Khan. It was my name. My handwriting. The note below read, "Don't open it again." I stared at it for a long time. Rationality is a loyal friend, especially to those who travel alone. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe a prank by someone who'd read my blog. But this place had no signal, no posted reviews. No one should have known I'd be here. I hadn't told anyone, not even my editor. Not yet. That night, the knocking began. It came precisely at 12:08 a.m., 3 gentle taps, measured, like the way a nurse knocks before checking a room. I sat up in bed, heart thudding against the silence. The hallway was as dark as before. No lights came through the cracks. I waited. No voice followed. No repetition. Just 3 knocks, and then stillness. I didn't answer. When I finally fell asleep, it was uneasy. I dreamed I was standing in front of the clock, and it was ticking, but not forward. The hands moved in reverse, fast and silent. Each tick seemed louder than the last, until it wasn't sound at all but pressure in my ears. I woke up sweating, my mouth dry. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The kind you slip into when you're already half anxious. I took a walk through the woods behind the lodge to clear my head. The pines were thick and tall. Snow clung to the undersides of branches like warning signs. About 15 minutes in, I stopped walking, because I could hear my own name. Not shouted. Not spoken. Whispered. Once. Clearly. No one was there. That night, I didn't lock the door, but I pushed a chair against it. Just in case. I told myself I was being cautious. Logical. At 12:08, the knocks came again. And something whispered. You said you'd come back. I didn't sleep. Not after that. The morning came, though it didn't feel like it. The sun never quite reached the guest house. Just a pale, diffused light filtered through the gray clouds. It gave the walls a lifeless, yellow tone, as if the building didn't reflect daylight so much as endure it. I made coffee again. Same tin of bitter instant, same chipped mug I'd left on the desk the night before. But this time, the mug was warm when I picked it up. And I hadn't turned the kettle on yet. I stood there for a while, one hand resting on the handle, listening. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty now. It felt pressed in. Like the quiet had weight to it. I checked my notebook, mostly out of habit. I kept scattered thoughts there, lines for articles, strange details to explore. But something new had appeared. He begins to doubt the door. It was written in the middle of the page, between an unfinished sentence and a doodle I didn't remember drawing. The handwriting looked like mine, but the spacing was wrong, too neat. I hadn't written it. At least not when I was fully awake. I told myself I'd scribbled it in a half-dream. Writers do that, I reasoned. You wake up, write something down, forget you ever did. I wanted to believe that. I did. Later, I sat in the lounge downstairs, watching the pendulum of the clock. It still hadn't moved. 12:08, always. I tried pushing it gently to start the swing again, just to break the illusion, but the pendulum wouldn't budge. Like it was welded in place. I turned away. There was another notebook in the bookshelf by the window. Bound in green fabric, spine cracked from age. No title. I opened it, expecting old guest notes or local legends. Instead, I found blank pages, except the last one. It knows when you don't believe it. Nothing else. I put the notebook back. My fingers were cold, though the room wasn't. Around noon, the caretaker left a tray by my door. Tea, biscuits? I hadn't asked for it. She never knocked. Just left it quietly and disappeared. When I opened the door, I glanced down the hallway. The end door, the one I'd thought was locked since arrival, was ajar. Just slightly. I took a step toward it. The air shifted, faint but unmistakable. Like walking into a room that had just been vacated. Not cold exactly, but wrong. Heavy. I stopped, stared at the door for a long time. Then turned back and closed mine. I didn't eat much that day. Couldn't focus. I tried writing, but my thoughts tangled. I'd start a paragraph and lose it halfway through. The words on the screen felt foreign, even the ones I typed. By evening, the clouds had thickened. Snow started falling, not heavy, just a fine, constant drift that covered the path leading down to the road. The forest behind the house turned to shadow. I called a friend in Lahore, Sammy. Told him I wasn't sleeping well. Maybe it's altitude, he said, voice tinny through static. That can mess with your head. I heard something else then. A second voice. Not his. Just faint. Breathing, maybe? A whisper I couldn't catch. I asked him if anyone was with him. He paused. What? No. I thought you said something. We both went quiet. Then he said something strange. You okay, man? You sound far. The line dropped before I could answer. That night I didn't undress. I lay on the bed fully clothed, my phone beside me, though I knew the signal wouldn't hold. The lights flickered once. I didn't bother trying to fix them. I watched the shadows in the corner of the room lengthen as the moon shifted. My watch read 12:04. I didn't move. At 12:08, right on cue, came the knock. 3 taps. Calm. Familiar now. But this time, they didn't stop. A pause, then again. 3 more. I stayed in bed. Not from bravery, just paralysis. It didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like recognition. Like this moment had already happened and I was only catching up to it. Then something new. A voice. Soft, female. Not a whisper, not a moan. Something between. Beta. One word. That's all. My mother used to say it like that, stretching it slightly, turning it into comfort. I hadn't heard her voice in 2 years, not since the hospital. But this wasn't comfort. This was mimicry. I stood slowly. Walked to the door. My hand hovered over the knob. I don't know how long I stayed there. Listening. Waiting. Eventually, the knock didn't return. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair until dawn, watching the hallway through the gap beneath the door. No footsteps. No sound. But just before the sky began to lighten, I noticed the mirror above the dresser was fogged. Thick, like after a long, hot shower. But the room was ice cold. I walked toward it, wiping a patch clear with my palm. No reflection. The mirror showed the room, yes, but I wasn't in it. I stared at the space where I should have been standing. Just empty floor. I turned around quickly. The room behind me looked normal. I looked back into the mirror. Still nothing. Then something moved in the reflection. A figure. Standing just outside the room. Near the hallway. Not walking. Not breathing. Just present. I didn't look at it. I turned the mirror to face the wall, went back to the chair, and waited for the light. The next morning, I checked the guest book again. A new entry had appeared below the old one. Same name. Same date, 2028. He opened the wrong door tonight. But I hadn't opened anything. Not yet. I spent the morning watching the frost melt from the window. A thin film of ice had formed along the inside glass, even though the radiator beneath it had been on all night. Outside, the snow from the day before had settled into an untouched layer across the yard, except for a single line of footprints. They led from the woods to the back of the house. Just one pair. No return trail. I hadn't left the room. The caretaker hadn't brought breakfast. No tray, no knock. I didn't go looking for her. I didn't feel like seeing her eyes again, how they never quite focused on anything, how they always looked just past you, like someone else was standing behind. Instead, I boiled water and poured it over stale tea bags I found in a drawer. The mug was cold in my hands, and I held it more for comfort than anything else. At some point, I checked the guest book again. It hadn't moved from the side table. The cover felt damp, though my fingers were dry. I opened it, flipping past my name, past the message that hadn't been there days before. Another entry had appeared. Same handwriting. Same date. You hear it now. Don't let it in. I closed the book. Pushed it aside. Sat for a long time without moving. The house creaked more than usual that day. The kind of sound wood makes when it remembers being alive. I tried to convince myself it was the cold, the shifting of age-old beams. But the sounds weren't random. They had rhythm. Almost like breathing. And sometimes they came from inside the walls. I tried calling Sammy again around noon. The phone rang once, then stopped. No voice, no signal. Just static. I left it on the table and didn't touch it after that. The light outside never changed. Gray, dim, unwavering. I checked my watch. It said 4:17 p.m. The grandfather clock downstairs still read 12:08. I didn't want to be in the room anymore. But I didn't want to leave either. I was caught between stillness and motion, unsure which felt worse. Eventually, I stood and stepped into the hallway. It was colder there. Not in the normal way, not like open windows or drafty corners. It felt like walking through breath that wasn't yours. I moved slowly, my hand trailing along the wall as if that might anchor me. The floor underfoot was solid, but each board gave slightly, like it wasn't convinced I belonged. I passed the closed doors of other rooms, and used unlit. Their numbers had worn away. Then I reached the end of the hall. The door. It was shut again. I stared at the knob. Brass, slightly tarnished. No keyhole. No sign it had ever been locked. Just a plain wooden door, unremarkable in every way. And yet it had waited. My breath caught. I hadn't touched it before. Not really. But it had changed things by being open. That crack, just wide enough to suggest invitation. I turned the knob. Slowly. It gave without resistance. The door didn't creak. It opened inward with an unsettling calm. No dust. No cobwebs. The room looked prepared. There was a chair in the center. Wooden. Slightly tilted toward the wall. A small table beside it held a mirror, turned to face the floor. No windows. No bed. Just walls. Bare. Empty. And something else. A notebook. Identical to mine. Same brand, same black cover. It lay closed on the floor beside the chair. I picked it up. There were no entries. Then, as I held it, words began to appear. Slowly, in my own handwriting. "You've already sat down." I dropped it. Took a step back. The door creaked, just slightly, but didn't move. I didn't sit. I left the room, shutting the door gently behind me. I didn't lock it. There was no key. Back in my room, the air felt thinner. As if something had followed me. I turned the mirror back up, just to check. My reflection had returned. My face looked tired. My eyes didn't blink when I did. I turned the mirror down again. That night I didn't wait in bed. I sat by the door, back against it, legs pulled close. I didn't check the time. But I knew when it came. The knock. 3 soft taps. Then a pause. Then the voice. "It's me, Beta. Let me in." I said nothing. My throat tightened. I held my breath until I felt lightheaded. The knocking didn't return. But I knew something was on the other side. Waiting. After a long silence, I heard the floorboard by the mirror creak. I didn't move. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke to faint light. The air was warmer. Too warm. I went downstairs, moving slowly. My hands felt distant, like they didn't belong to me. I passed the grandfather clock. Still 12:08. Except now, the pendulum was swinging. Not fast. Not steady. Just enough to make you feel it was catching up. The caretaker was standing by the reception desk. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You opened it," she said quietly. I didn't respond. She slid a folded paper across the counter. It was my invoice. The checkout date was May 14th, 2028. I hadn't paid for that far ahead. Back in my room, I packed slowly. My clothes were folded already, though I didn't remember doing it. My camera battery was full, though I hadn't charged it. I didn't ask questions. Before leaving, I glanced at the guest book one last time. There was no entry with my name. Just one new line at the bottom. He finally understood what the knocking wanted. I stepped outside. The snow had melted in a perfect path from the house to the woods. I followed it. The air was still. The silence no longer watched, it waited. Behind me, the clock continued to tick. But it wasn't keeping time anymore.